Is Lyft being deceitful? Is it lying to you in a sense? They're not telling you the full truth when it comes to their new payment policy that now you get, or all drivers get, 70% of whatever the passengers pay, not counting the fees that Lyft has to incur in order to run the app, etc., etc. I'm going to be honest, I just posted a video about this yesterday, and I saw a lot of comments of people saying, yeah, Mark, I get what you're saying. This is great, heavy quotation marks, but I don't think this is really like a legit thing. I think it's Lyft's way of pretending like they're actually paying their drivers the way they should be getting paid and everything. But I'm going to be honest, I just don't think it's legit, basically. And it's another way of Lyft trying to act like they care about the drivers, but they really don't. I think that multiple things can be true at the same time. And I'm very honest in all my videos with the pros and the cons. This is going to be very kind of casual, fireside chat style video talking about what Lyft just did. And like I said, to sum that up, Lyft says, look, now we're going to do something where you get a minimum, I'll call it threshold, because it's not really an hourly guarantee, of course, but you get a minimum threshold, then you get 70% of whatever passengers pay. And when I talked about that in the previous video, a lot of people were not happy about it. And for me in that video, if you watch it, I'm very happy about it, right? And I think this is a great idea. I'm going to be honest, although yes, I understand where a lot of drivers are coming from saying, hey, Mark, they're just manipulating numbers. Lyft takes out a lot of fees when it comes to rideshare driving. I think that although, and like I said, multiple things can be right at the same time. I think although, yes, a lot of times companies do things just to kind of save face. Just to be like, hey, we really care about our drivers. But in actuality, they're manipulating the numbers to make it seem like they care when they really don't. They're just saying it so people don't get mad at them as a company. On the other end, I think that things or certain things can be a very big step forward. And I think this is one of them. I think both things are actually true. And like I said, I've bashed Lyft and Uber pretty hard in a lot of videos. I've also talked about a lot of the pros of driving. And I will say with this, one, my biggest thing that I like about this is one, at least they're trying to show that they care. And I know it's kind of tough because you see this a lot with companies. I know that some companies will be like, oh, we donated a lot. And it's like, do you donate a lot because you genuinely care about the environment or people or the homeless or those who are in poverty? Or do you just do it to make yourself seem better, right? I mean, I remember, for example, and this happens all the time, I feel like every time it's Pride Month, right? Every company changes their logo to like the rainbow colors. And it's like, are you doing that because you genuinely want to support Pride and LGBTQ plus rights and everything? Or are you just doing that to make yourself seem to make yourself seem better, right? There's one meme I saw somewhere. There's kind of interesting. I think it was Amazon, where all the Amazon like Twitters were the rainbow colors for Pride, but then the Amazon like Saudi Arabia and the Amazon Twitter pages in more heavily conservative countries did not change, right? And it's like, okay, that's a clear indication you don't really care about Pride. You're just trying to do it to make yourself seem better. Now that could be the case with Lyft. I could be honest though, I'd much rather company at least try to do something than not. So my stance, being honest, kind of doing like a follow-up video from yesterday, is I really still do like this. The biggest thing for me, I think, is that we now have a foundation. This is the big kind of point on this video, because I've thought a lot about this after reading the comments of a lot of people saying, hey, Mark, like, I get where you're coming from, but like, even so, they're taking out a ton of fees. They're doing this, they're doing that. Two big things, the threshold and the transparency of pricing. Starting, I guess, with the latter. I do like it that now, with Lyft, they will show you the price breakdown exactly. Is that perfect? No. Does that mean you're going to make a ton of more money? No. Let's be honest, right? I like to look at both sides. I think it's very important to do so. But at least it's a start. At least it's something that's better. Like, at least today is better for driving for Lyft than it was before this got put into place, right? I've said this before, and as an example, when I was in New Orleans for Mardi Gras, the drivers were telling me their passenger was paying $40 for an airport ride. They were only getting 14 of that. And they're like, what's happening? At least the transparency will provide more context. And who knows, maybe some things get revealed that we're like, wait a minute, we didn't know Lyft was charging for that. And this happens all the time, that we realize there's an extra fee. The public finds out about it. A bunch of stuff happens where we're like, oh my God, why are they charging this? And then Lyft removes it or something like this. It happens all the time. So I think the transparency, I actually think is a really good thing. At least you know exactly how things are breaking down. The bigger one, though, or the former positive point about this, is like I said in that video, ignoring fees, and the reason why it's more just easier for math, for conceptual. But let's say after fees and everything, the passengers paid $100, you made $60 in that week. Lyft, out of their own pocket, will give you an extra $10. That means you're going to make, no matter what, at least 70% of whatever the passengers paid, not counting fees. Anything past that, those profit. If you made 80%, you keep 80. You don't get demoted, in a sense, back down to 70. Now, there are some people who commented, and I think it's a very valid point, like, oh, well, this is the case anyway, right? Like, you're probably, after fees, going to make about 70%. So that could be the case. It could be that Lyft says, you know what? Most people make 73%. Very rarely do drivers make under 70% of what passengers paying. So we're just going to say that we're doing a minimum guarantee now. There could be some truth to that. And again, these two different things, the pros and the cons, could be both true at the exact same time. And I think they are that, yes, maybe Lyft is doing this as a way to try to act like they care about drivers, but I still think of this. At the end of the day, this is the first time that any rideshare company ever in history has gone out of their way to give a minimum guarantee that's permanent. And I want to stress, I have no affiliation with Lyft. I have no affiliation with Uber. That should be very clear to anybody who's watching my videos, as I've bashed them pretty hard. And I'm very honest. I like to be very honest. And I think it's always important to look at both sides, which I think is an important thing to do. And that's what I do a lot in my YouTube videos, is trying to look at both sides of the coin, both sides of the equation. Because back in the day, this is years ago, I did a video, I think it was like 3 or 4 months ago. I can't remember when. Maybe longer, I'm not sure, where I revealed and showed my earnings in 2015, just to show drivers what it used to be like. And back in the day, Lyft had minimum hourly guarantees for a given period of time. I think it was something like you had to do minimum 2 rides an hour, and I think you had to have like a 90% acceptance rate. I think those were the kind of the guidelines or rules or whatever, and then you got a minimum hourly guarantee. And I showed you that they used to email me and say, hey, Mark, this week in Boston, 7 to 9 a.m., minimum $60 an hour, but back in the day, Lyft took out 20%, so I would make minimum $48 an hour driving for Lyft. If I made 20, and a lot of times I did, or 25, they bumped me up to 48 after the Lyft fee, which was back in the day 20%. I got 80%. That was way back in the day, though, because now I know things are a lot worse when it comes to how much Lyft and Uber takes out and their cut. And I also know, which is kind of unfortunate, it's also kind of weird how it fluctuates from area to area. Like, the biggest comments I've seen, which is weird. This doesn't really make a lot of sense. Like, maybe I should do this as like a dedicated video, but it's weird that Miami I've seen, or maybe just Miami drivers speak up the most, tough to say. Miami seems to be the worst city to drive in terms of not necessarily how much money you make, per se, because I've heard that you can make an okay amount, but that of how much Lyft and Uber is taking out. I've had people in Miami tell me that they make, that Uber and Lyft takes out about 60 to 70% of what they make, which almost flip-flop. Like, back in the day, it was 20-80. They got 20%, I got 80%. Now it seems like it's almost flip-flopping in a place like Miami, and I got a lot of comments about that as well on the previous video I talked about. And again, I think that multiple things can be true at the same time, like I said numerous times already in this video. But I think the biggest thing about this that I'm just really excited about is we have a minimum barrier. And from my perspective, at least I hope, that this will be something that will follow suit. That is the first breadcrumb. And I think, especially when something like this happens, I always like to look in the future. I think that this is, as far as I know, like I said, the first time, I'm pretty sure it is, that a company said permanently, we're giving you a minimum guarantee. Lyft used to do it back in the day, like I said, but it was only for the peak hours. It was only for a couple of times here and there. It would fluctuate. It wasn't a set in stone thing. Like, every week they would email me the minimum hourly guarantees in terms of when I would drive and how much it was. But this is the first time I think a company says, look, across the board, where you drive, how you drive, whatever, 70% is what you're going to get in terms of the passengers. And if you make anything less than that, we're going to bump it up to you. Which brings up a very important third point that I think is very easy to overlook, that now Lyft is taking money out of its pocket if you don't get compensated enough. Now, I know there are definitely going to be some people saying, well, Mark, Lyft's already making a ton of money. They're already taking all this money away from their drivers. They're stealing revenue from drivers and everything. That's horrible. Like, we deserve some of that money back. And yes, I agree 100% that Lyft should be paying their drivers more. Uber should. That should 100% go without saying. But I think the one thing I just like about this is that it's the first time, like I said, a company's really gone out of their way to say, look, we're going to do a permanent guarantee across the board that now is a minimum threshold that no matter what, you're at least going to make this amount. Again, it depends driver to driver, right? It's not like a fixed thing, so to speak, in terms of the amount of, saying, 20 an hour, right? It's like, okay, 70% of what the passengers pay. And if it's not, if that threshold's not reached, Lyft out of its own pocket will bump you up to that. I think this is an amazing first start. Like I said in that previous video, I called it independent contractor with benefits. That this is the type of thing I feel like you would get if you were an employee or like a quasi-like an employee. And so that's why now drivers, like I said, are more quasi-like employees or independent contractor with benefits, which is this great area where this kind of stuff of saying, hey, you're going to get 70% or whatever, kind of reminds me a little bit of sales. Like I remember, when I've done sales companies and work for sales companies, they're like, hey, you're going to get, I'm making this up, 70% of the earnings. Whatever the people pay, you get 70% of that. If for whatever reason the math doesn't work out that you don't, we're going to make sure you get compensated up to that. So no matter what, you're just going to get 70% of what the people are paying. Kind of reminds me a lot of sales, right? And that's something that a lot of these companies are doing or do in sales, and it's now translating over. Now, I'm curious to see if Uber will follow suit. I don't know. Uber, I've noticed, doesn't really care as much about their drivers. At least Lyft's trying. I know some people, and again, bringing back to that Pride example, I think it's a very good kind of analogy or example where I think a lot of times when David Reisher does something, and again, I'm a huge fan of him, when he does something, I think a lot of people think like, oh, he doesn't really care about drivers. He's doing it to make himself seem better. He could be doing it to make Lyft seem better, et cetera, et cetera. I think that could be true. And again, you never know. Like I said in that Pride example, sometimes companies do things just to seem better in the public light. But also, I've heard of things like him going out and driving and interviewing different drivers. I know that he tries to go on Twitter a lot in response to a lot of people's complaints. I know he gave out his personal email and said, hey, if you have an issue, please email me. And I'm like, okay, maybe he's doing it to seem better in the public light, but also he doesn't have to do that. Like, Uber is not trying in any way, shape, or form to seem better at all. Uber's like, whatever. Like, Uber doesn't really care. I think I gotta compare that at least he's trying, and I appreciate the effort to try. And again, in some ways, I think he has succeeded. I think Lyft has been doing better. If you look at all the analytics and the numbers don't lie. Lyft's been doing better for both passengers and drivers. Tough to balance that equation, right? And when you include shareholders, kind of the third part of that equation, very difficult. I think David Reich has done an amazing job, and I respect someone going out of their way to try to put policies in place that could be the first breadcrumb. This could be, and I know this is like going a little bit down the rabbit hole, a slight bit, but this could be the first time, or the first breadcrumb, that leads us going down this path that says, you know what? Now there's a minimum hourly guarantee nationwide, or now there's a minimum. Now there's a new law. I'm making this stuff up. There's a new law that rideshare drivers have to get 70% of the earnings from passengers, or else Lyft and Uber gets fined. Right? This could be that first breadcrumb, because again, we've never seen anything like this in the ride-sharing world, and I know a lot of drivers immediately get skeptical, especially when you include fees, which is kind of a whole other thing, because it depends upon the area, it depends upon a lot of different factors. That's why it's kind of tough to give a one-size-fits-all example when it comes to fees. And I do know the fees are pretty ridiculous, and Lyft takes out a lot. And I know a lot of drivers have said even things like, hey, Mark, I'm going to get over 70% no matter what. But like Lyft's kind of manipulating the numbers to make it seem better. And I think that is true to an extent. I do think that Lyft probably came to that 70% in a very kind of simple way of like being like, okay, we're pretty certain and safe that we can do this without regretting it, without having to shell out too much money. I do think that there is some truth to that. There is some number manipulation. It's the same thing like say when you go to like buy a car and the person's like, oh, we're going to give you a discount here and here and here, and they make it seem like you're saving money, but they're just moving numbers around and using almost like math magic, if that's a good way to word that. Just seem like you're saving money, but they just manipulate the numbers and use these kind of like magical mathematics, so to speak, to make it seem better when they just move stuff around. Lyft could be doing that, but at the end of the day, this is still something in place. That now that you have an actual bottom threshold, when before that didn't exist. before you could go out and drive, and you know, you never know what you're going to make, and you kind of at the mercy of all this kind of stuff. I think at least now that you know, there is going to be an extent that even if, like, say, you don't make the money that you're going to make, Lyft is going to pay you out of your own pocket. I think that's huge, right? And again, like I said, I do think that although, yes, there is a lot of valid arguments to say they're just doing this to save face, they're just doing this to look better in the public, they already pay about 70% of what the passengers pay, so they're just trying to make it seem better, they're just manipulating the numbers to make it seem better, they're trying to trick drivers, all these kind of negative and like very pessimistic viewpoints, I think are all true. I think there's a lot of truth to them. But in an optimistic way, I think there's a lot of truth to say. This is the first time something like this has happened in a very permanent, across-the-board way. And so this is, I think, at least to me, one of my favorite things I've seen any rideshare company do, at least recently. That's, I think, a very good move. And although it may be questionable, I still think it's a very solid move and a solid step in the right direction.